So as a starting point for coming up with alternatives for a section for a collector roadway project, we look to our design criteria as well as our planning documents. And the figure on the screen here is the typical section for a collector roadway in Anchorage from our Anchorage Design Criteria Manual. And so starting from left to right, a typical collector roadway will have a 5 to 10 foot pathway, which may consist of a concrete sidewalk on the lower end of the widths, or on the upper end of the widths may consist of asphalt surfaced multi-use path that's designed to be used by all users regardless of ability. And so they're designed to be ADA compliant. We have a 0 to 7 foot separation, so the pedestrian facilities could be attached to the back of curb, or they could be separated up to 7 feet. We have a 2 foot curb and gutter, a shoulder that ranges from 3.5 to 5 feet, and then a 10 to 12 foot travel lane, and then the section repeats itself on the other side. I wanted to point out note D below, pedestrian facilities must be provided on both sides of a collector road. The minimum width of a sidewalk is 5 feet. Multi-use pathways may vary in width between 8 to 10 feet. So the first plan in the presentation is the Anchorage Pedestrian Plan. The Anchorage Pedestrian Plan identifies a priority project for 120th Avenue to install missing sidewalks along the corridor. Our proposed alternatives will conform to the plan by constructing pedestrian facilities along the corridor. On the second plan we're looking at is the Anchorage Bicycle Plan. The Anchorage Bicycle Plan calls for bicycle lanes along the corridor, as well as a separated multi-use pathway along the corridor. So our proposed alternatives will conform to this plan by proposing installation of bicycle lanes along with proposed separated multi-use pathway. Some of the design challenges along the corridor include a right-of-way that is 60-foot width, which is the minimum width for a collector. Some collectors have 70-foot right-of-ways, which allow additional room for some of the features that are required on a collector roadway. In our case, we're at the minimum width of 60 foot. We have a mix of residential and industrial uses along the corridor. We have an at-grade railroad crossing, and we have some utilities. We have actually a fairly limited amount of utilities along the corridor. We do have an N-Star natural gas line that we anticipate needing to relocate. We have AWU water and sewer on the Johns Road end of the project, which we anticipate we will not be disturbing. And then we have minimal existing storm drain infrastructure along the corridor, which will require us to extend storm drain to accommodate the drainage on 120th. We also have a fair amount of grade on the project, in particular between Ocean Point Drive to Division Street and at the intersection approaches. We want to also acknowledge that the folks in Eldon subdivision have initiated the process for a water improvement district. And while that's not included in our scope, our project is willing to work alongside any water improvement projects and make sure that the deep utilities, the water and sewer improvements that are proposed go in ahead of our improvements, so that our improvements won't be disturbed by those future projects. So I wanted to touch on one of the design challenges, specifically the grade between Ocean Point Drive and Division Street. This figure on the top, you see a plan view of the survey that was conducted along the corridor. And this view extends from Ocean Point Drive on the left to Division Street on the right. North is top of page. And there's a line down the center of the plan view, dark black line, alternating long and short dashes. And that line represents the center line of the right-of-way along the corridor. you'll see that at Ocean Point Drive, 120th Avenue is the existing 120th Avenue paved surface is largely on the north side of that center line. And when you get across to Division Street, it's more centered in the right of way. The bottom figure is the profile along this section between Ocean Point Drive and Division Street, and the dark dashed line represents the existing ground along that center line that I pointed out above. And what you see forming along the existing ground here is a crest vertical curve. And when you have a crest vertical curve along a corridor, it restricts your stopping site distance for folks traveling on the corridor. So for instance, if you were traveling from Johns Road towards Old Stewart Highway and you were at Ocean Point Drive, your ability to see the intersection at Division Street is limited, if not impossible, because of the crest vertical curve that exists along this section. Also, there's a lighter dash line above the center line dash line and a solid lighter line at the bottom. These represent the ground surface at either end of the right-of-way as you go across the right-of-way. And so what you can see here is if you start on the north side of the right-of-way and go across, you're losing elevation, more than 5 feet of elevation across the right-of-way. So this is another view of that last piece that I pointed out. Across the right-of-way, we have the northern boundary, which was top of page before, and we have the southern boundary, which was bottom page before. And you can see that the elevation drops across the right-of-way. We also have depicted the Ocean Point condo buildings and their location relative to the right-of-way. And in this view, we have the existing 120th Avenue shown, and it's 26 feet of asphalt surface. So our project is going to install a larger section than the existing 26 feet. And there's several ways to install a larger section on a corridor. And the first is to just go ahead and match the grade of the existing roadway. And what we find if we do that is that on the southern side of the corridor, in particular between Ocean Point Drive and Division Street, we see that there's a requirement to bring in some fill, and in order to keep the improvements within the right-of-way, we would need to construct a retaining wall on the south side of the roadway, or construct a slope, acquire right-of-way or a slope easement to construct a slope onto the Ocean Point condo development. This retaining wall, if we place it in this location, due to its proximity to the pedestrian facilities, would require fall protection, which would be an increased cost for constructing a retaining wall if we were to go with this option of placing the road vertically. The other option that we looked at, and what we consider our preferred option for our profile, is a cut option, where we cut into the existing road and actually put the new road at a lower elevation than the existing road. And this moves the earthwork to the north side of the road, where we're doing cutting as opposed to filling on the south side. There's still a minor amount of fill on the south side, but the bulk of the earthwork is cutting. And then in order to keep our impacts limited to the right-of-way, we would construct a retaining wall at the property line or acquire a slope easement to slope our cutout to match existing grade. And this retaining wall would not be adjacent to, or would not have pedestrian facilities behind it, so may not require a fall protection, potentially lowering the cost of building the retaining wall. So each of these alternatives, as we look at them, they're based off of the profile where we cut into the earth, as opposed to trying to build the road where it currently exists between Ocean Point Drive and Division Street. Here we have the first alternative that we're going to show you today. The left side of this typical section represents the north side of the road. The right side of the typical section represents the south side of the road. And for this typical section, starting on the north side or the left side, we have a 3-foot space to install streetlights, a 5-foot space for our concrete sidewalk, a 5-foot vegetated buffer, a 2-foot curb and gutter, a 4-foot bike lane, 2 11-foot drive lanes, another 4-foot bike lane, a 2-foot curb and gutter, a 3-foot pattern concrete buffer to an 8-foot asphalt surface pathway, leaving us 2 feet on the far end or the south end to tie into existing grade. Having the buffer on the north side of the road, the landscape buffer on the north side of the road, allows us to make up a little bit of grade across the section, because we have limited number of driveways or access points where we need to tie in the sidewalk at the same elevation as the roadway. So we can use the fact that we have a lack of connection points along that side of the road to allow us to make up a little bit of that grade in that vegetated buffer. So here we have an enlarged view of what we just looked at as far as the plan side of the previous figure is enlarged. And so you can see that this proposed alternative from Johns Road to somewhere around halfway through the Ocean Point development. And you can see on the north side, we have our 5-foot concrete sidewalk. And then south of that, the 5-foot vegetated buffer, our curb and gutter and our bike lane, our 2 travel lanes. And as we continue to move south, our bike lane, our curb and gutter, our pattern concrete buffer, and our 8-foot pathway. So here is another enlarged view, again, about halfway down the Ocean Point Drive, or excuse me, the Ocean Point condos to around the railroad right away. And again, we have the 5-foot vegetated buffer with the 5-foot concrete sidewalk on the north, and the 8-foot pathway with the 3-foot pattern concrete buffer on the south. And for the last section here, from the railroad right away to the Old Seward Highway, again with our 5-foot concrete sidewalk on the north with the 5-foot vegetated buffer, the 8-foot concrete pathway on the south with the 3-foot pattern concrete buffer. We're also showing here the railroad crossing and the road widening out at the railroad crossing to accommodate the features that come along with the quiet zone railroad crossing that we'll discuss later in the presentation. So considerations for this alternative: there's snow storage provided on both sides of the street in the pedestrian buffers. There's no design variances needed from the design criteria manual. It's fully compliant with the design criteria manual. And there's no variances needed from the Anchorage Municipal Code. It's again fully compliant with the Anchorage Municipal Code. However, it lacks space for constructing retaining wall, even with the vegetated buffer making up some grade for us. We would still need retaining walls with this option. And in order to install retaining walls, we would have to acquire additional right-of-way or additional easement, or if we weren't going to go with retaining walls, if we were able to acquire slope easements, we could go with slope easements. But either way, there's not enough room to do that within the right-of-way. It would have to be through acquiring additional right-of-way or easement. So now this is, we are moving on to section, or excuse me, alternative 2. And for this particular alternative, we have 2 sections. This is the first section, and it's intended to apply between Johns Road and Division Street, and also between the Alaska Railroad right-of-way and the Old Seward Highway. And so again, the left side of the section is north, and the right side of the section is south. And so from the left side or the north side, we have a 3-foot space reserved for installing retaining wall. We have a 3-foot space reserved for installing lighting. Then we have a 5-foot concrete sidewalk, 2 feet curb and gutter, 4 feet of bike lane, 2 11-foot travel lanes, another 4-foot bike lane, 2 feet of curb and gutter, a 5-foot vegetated buffer, an 8-foot pathway, and we're left with 2 feet of space to make up grade at the south end of the section. And then the second section for alternative 2 is intended to apply between Division Street and the Alaska Railroad right-of-way. And again, left side is the north side, the right side is the south side. And so from the left or the north side, we have the 3-foot space reserved for retaining wall, 3-foot space for street lighting, 5-foot space for our concrete sidewalk, 2 feet for curb and gutter, 4-foot bike lane, 2 11-foot travel lanes, another 4-foot bike lane, 2-foot curb and gutter. Now we switch to a 3-foot pattern concrete buffer between the road and our 8-foot asphalt pathway, and that's left us now with 4 feet between the pathway and the edge of right-of-way to make up grades and match grades with existing. And the reason we've selected this section for this portion of the corridor is because of these residential properties that are located south of the 120th Avenue, and they have a need to provide multiple driveways along that section. And in order to eliminate or limit the impacts of grading those driveways to match the roadway, we were planning to leave a little bit of extra space for ourselves to make up that grade in the right of way and not extend or limit the amount of it that we would extend into property to make those driveways work along those residential properties. But we still need to keep the concrete buffer. We can't completely eliminate it because in addition to driveways, these properties have individual mailboxes. Now we need a place to locate those mailboxes. So the buffer provides the space for the mailboxes. There's a picture inset in the slide that shows a similar application on 40th Avenue here in town, where a patterned concrete buffer was installed with a sidewalk to accommodate mailboxes. In our case, we'd be a patterned concrete buffer with an 8-foot asphalt pathway as opposed to the sidewalk shown in the picture. So here we have an expanded, enlarged view of this alternative from Johns Road to Division Street. And we can see from north to south, we have our 5-foot sidewalk, our curb and gutter, our bike lane, our 2 travel lanes, another bike lane, and then our 5-foot vegetated buffer and our 8-foot pathway along this section. And now an enlarged view from Division Street to the railroad right-of-way. The north side, we have, again, our 5-foot sidewalk, our curb and gutter, our bike lane, our 2 travel lanes, another bike lane, and then the patterned concrete buffer, and finally the 8-foot pathway on the south side of the road. Then lastly, an enlarged view from the railroad right-of-way to the old Seward Highway. And here we've gone back to the 5-foot concrete sidewalk on the north and the 5-foot vegetated buffer with the 8-foot asphalt pathway on the south. So considerations for alternative 2, it provides space within the right of way for retaining walls that we need to make up the grade across the section. A design variance is needed from the design criteria manual because the manual requires when you have a 5-foot, or excuse me, when you have an attached sidewalk, the manual requires shoulder width of 5 feet. And in our case, our 4-foot bike lane, we have a 4-foot bike lane in place of a shoulder. but that 4 feet is not 5 feet. So we would need to request a variance to allow the shoulder to be 4 feet as opposed to 5 feet on the north side where the sidewalk's attached. We would not need variances from the municipal code. This alternative is compliant with municipal code. This alternative, though, does provide limited snow storage space as there's only buffer on one side. There would be some space behind the sidewalk on the north, but that's it's difficult for our maintenance folks to actually get snow over there with the equipment that they use. So alternative 3 is taking alternative 2 and applying traffic calming measures. So as part of our traffic study, we did a traffic calming memo, and that's in the appendix of the traffic study, which will be in the appendix of the design study report. And that memo had a couple options in it for possible traffic calming measures that could be installed along the corridor. In particular, they were located at intersections of Ocean Point Drive and Division Street. And so for both intersections, intersection neck down or roadway was considered a possible traffic calming measure. And that's depicted on the top figure on the slide. And an intersection neck down or roadway narrowing reduces pedestrian crossing distances, increases pedestrian visibility during crossings, potentially reduces traffic speeds, and typically does not require additional right-of-way, but it also eliminates bike lanes at intersections and requires bicyclists to either utilize the pedestrian infrastructure or the vehicle lane to get across the intersection. At Division Street, at Ocean Point Drive, where we have the existing mid-block crossing for the elementary school, pedestrian refuge island was also an option that was considered for traffic calming. On a pedestrian refuge island provides mid-crossing storage for pedestrians, increases pedestrian visibility, potentially reduces traffic speed, but may require additional right-of-way to implement. So as I said before, this alternative is the same as alternative 2 from a section standpoint. We're going to find that the differences occur down in the plan view as opposed to the section view. So here we have the alternative 2 section applying from Johns Road to Division Street, and again from the railroad right-of-way to Old Seward Highway, and that includes the 3 feet of space reserved for the retaining wall, 5-foot sidewalk attached on the north side, 5-foot vegetated buffer, and an 8-foot pathway on the south. And then between Division Street and the railroad right-of-way, we transition to the pattern concrete buffer for the south pathway to give us the additional room to grade those residential lots along that section. And so here we have an expanded view of the first piece of the corridor here from Johns Road to Division Street, where we would be installing the 5-foot sidewalk on the north, the 5-foot vegetated buffer, and 8-foot pathway on the south. And you can see at the Ocean Point Drive intersection, we've incorporated neck down as well as pedestrian refuge island at the crossing. And you can also see that the bike lanes terminate on either side, and there's ramps available for the people on bikes to transition either onto the pedestrian infrastructure or to continue through on the travel lanes, the vehicle travel lanes. And so this is the next section that incorporates the pattern concrete with the 8-foot pathway and goes from Division Street to the railroad right-of-way. And in this figure, you can see at Division Street where we've incorporated the neck down, and we've also incorporated the bike lanes terminating prior to the neck down with curb ramps to get across the intersection should the person on a bike decide to cross as a pedestrian. They also have, as I mentioned before, the option of going through it using the vehicle lane. I'll just point out here that we've envisioned this, or at least at our concept level right now, we would widen the sidewalk on the north side for this section to sort of try to reduce conflict between folks on bikes who choose to maneuver through the intersection as pedestrians and folks who are walking or using that corridor as more traditional pedestrians. And so here's the last piece from the Alaska Railroad right away to the old Seward Highway. Again, with the 5-foot concrete sidewalk on the north, the 5-foot vegetated buffer on the south, and the 8-foot pathway also on the south. So the alternative 3 has the same considerations as alternative 2. It does reserve space for a retaining wall. There is a design variance needed for the shoulder width. There's no design variance needed from code, and there is limited snow storage provided. But in addition, we see the traffic calming the traffic calming incorporated, and typical reductions in speed from traffic calming measures vary from 1 to 27%. In the case of neck downs, this is generally on the lower end of that range. And then the other consideration for this alternative is bike lane users will need to transition to either pedestrian facilities or vehicular facilities at the intersections. I wanted to go over a few elements of design here at the end of the presentation, revisit grade and sort of finish that conversation about that crest vertical curve, as well as some of the comments that we heard about the intersection approaches. Also want to kind of show the impacts that we're anticipating to trees and vegetation along the corridor, discuss the Ocean View Elementary crosswalk, and also the railroad crossing. So here on the top of this figure, we have the plan view of alternative 2. And again, we have a bold, a dark black line alternating long and short dashes that represents the center line of the right of way. And you'll see the proposed improvements are roughly centered in the right of way. And then below that, we have the profile that shows the road profile or the grade profile along that line. And the top line, the dark short dash lines, is the existing ground where we see the crest vertical curve exists today. And below that, we have a lighter solid line that is our proposed profile, showing how we would remove most of that crest vertical curve and increase the sight distance along the corridor. Another comment we received was related to the Johns Road intersection and some of the challenges folks have maneuvering that intersection and possibly sliding at the intersection. So we're planning to look closely at the intersection and try to fix the grades to limit the amount of sliding that occurs there. And part of that is going to be reducing the grades going into the intersection from 120th. So in this figure, we have plan view on the top, and then the corresponding profile view below, with the dark dashed line being the existing ground and the lighter solid line being the proposed ground. And you'll notice that the existing ground is above the proposed ground, and that's because we're lowering the elevation along that section so that we can reduce the slope going into the Johns Road intersection. And on the old Seward Highway end, we also heard comments about the grade leading up to Old Seward Highway. The difference here is we're constrained on either end by things that we can't move vertically. The railroad on the west end is a point that we can't change vertically, and then the Old Seward Highway on the east end is another point that we can't change vertically. We also ultimately have to tie in at South Gamble Street as well. So we're not able to make as drastic changes to the approach to Old Seward Highway as we're anticipating with John's. However, we are planning to flatten out the approach as it gets closer to the Old Seward Highway. So you'll see the existing ground again depicted as a dark dashed line, and the proposed grade depicted as a lighter solid line. And as you approach Old Seward Highway, the proposed grade rises above existing grade to achieve a slightly flatter approach to Old Seward Highway. I also need to point out at this point that we're talking about the Old Seward Highway intersection. There was a DOT highway safety improvement project that was intended to address crash patterns that occur on Old Seward Highway at both the 120th Avenue intersection as well as the Industry Way intersection to the north. Our plan was to design limited improvements to the intersection at Old Seward Highway because the DOT project was looking at the big picture to make larger improvements that would address the crash patterns between both the intersections. Unfortunately, that highway safety improvement project has expired. I learned about that recently. So our understanding at this point is that the DOT is not pursuing improvements at the intersections for 120th Avenue and Industry Way on Old Seward Highway. We have a meeting scheduled with DOT to discuss with them to try to better understand how that the expiration of that project is going to impact our project. So as far as possible impacts to trees and vegetation, we're installing a much wider section into the right of way than exists. So in general, the trees that exist today in the right of way are going to need to be cleared, and some of that clearing we anticipate will extend beyond the right of way. So that's depicted here. We have the surveyed location of various trees along the right of way, and we've depicted on this figure in the blue hatching which areas we think are going to be cleared as a product of the improvements that we plan to install. So this extends from Johns Road to about halfway down the Ocean Point condo development, and then this section here picks up about halfway down the condo development and extends the railroad right away. My understanding is some of this clearing that's shown on the east end of this figure may have already occurred from our maintenance crews addressing some of the comments that we received. And then the last section here from the railroad right away to the Old Seward Highway. So regarding the Ocean View Elementary crosswalk, because we're doing a full upgrade project, we had to look at warrants on the crosswalk to completely reanalyze what would be done at this location. And the first warrant that we needed to look at was whether or not the crosswalk itself was warranted, because there's the potential that if the warrant wasn't met, then our upgrade project may have to eliminate the crosswalk. But thankfully, we found that the crosswalk warrant was met. We found that there is enough use at the crosswalk to warrant its remaining on the project or in the corridor. So our design includes the crosswalk. however, it relocates the crosswalk slightly east to align it with the Ocean Point Drive intersection. And it's currently located west of the intersection. The next warrant we looked at was whether or not we were justified in installing a reduced speed school zone to cover that crosswalk with a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit when school is dismissing and arriving. And we found that warrant was not met. We looked at the school zone in general, and we found that the Johns Road includes a reduced speed school zone that extends slightly to the south of 120th Avenue. And that includes signs and signals like the ones, or signs and flasher like the one you see pictured on the slide. We talked internally and decided that this project will request a variance to extend that existing reduced speed school zone along 120th Avenue and install one of these signs with the flashing beacons at the end of the reduced school zone to cover this crosswalk. And our initial conversations with traffic have been fairly positive for the idea of extending the existing reduced speed school zone onto 120th to cover the crosswalk, despite the warrants not being met. The crosswalk from the school onto Johns Road includes an overhead sign and overhead flashing beacons. The warrants for those, as well as for the adult crossing guard, are considered optional for the mid-block crossing here at 120th, and our discussions with traffic to date have not resulted in their willingness to have us install a similar overhead sign with flashing beacons. So the compromise we've come up with traffic is that we would install conduits below the roadway so that if a decision is made in the future to install the overhead signage and flashing beacons, that the road would not need to be excavated in order to accommodate that installation. So our last topic is the railroad crossing. We currently have a designated quiet zone crossing on 120th. That means that the railroad does not blow its horn. The trains do not blow their horn when they approach the intersection. And designating the intersection as a quiet, or the crossing as a quiet zone, involved a rigorous federal process. And as part of that process, there was a study done to determine what safety engineering features would be incorporated in the crossing to prevent accidents at the crossing. And the end result is something that looks like the middle picture in the figure, where you have the two gates with the medians that prevent cars from trying to go around the gates. As part of our project, we needed to look at the crossing for the new pedestrian facilities that we're installing, and so we brought together a diagnostic team that consists of a consultant, individual from the Department of Transportation, an individual from the municipality, as well as folks from the Alaska Railroad. And that team's mission is to look at the possible safety features that could be installed at the intersection, and then make a recommendation on what features the crossing should include in order to remain safe and also remain designated as a quiet zone. And so initially we were hopeful that the result the study would be the picture on the left of the figure with the 4-quadrant gate system, because that would allow the medians to be removed. And we heard, like we had mentioned earlier, we heard comments that folks didn't feel the medians were a safe feature along the roadway, that they were maybe causing hazards. And so we thought the 4-quadrant gate system might be a solution that would address those comments. However, the railroad does not have any 4-quadrant gate systems in their inventory, and it requires a different equipment and different maintenance knowledge in order to maintain it. And they currently don't have that an individual employed with the knowledge to maintain a 4-quadrant gate system. And so they are not supportive, generally not supportive of the system for that reason. Additionally, if they were to bring someone on to maintain a 4-quadrant system for the one system that we would be installing, they would pass the cost of that person on to the municipality, because the municipality is permitted. Our roads are permitted uses through the railroad right of way, and we reimburse the railroad for their maintenance costs related to our crossings, our road crossings across their right of way. So that cost, if Alaska Railroad were to seek out a staff person to maintain that 4-gate system, it would be passed on to the municipality. So at this point, we anticipate that the diagnostic team will have a preferred alternative that looks substantially similar to the existing configuration, which is the 2 gates for vehicular control along with medians. So I've included here an enlarged version of the crossing as it's currently envisioned, although the final design study will further refine and determine how exactly the road will tie in at the railroad. We are showing median to accommodate the barriers. The gates that are currently shown are the existing gates. We're not showing any proposed gates on this figure because we don't have the exact locations for the proposed gates. The other thing that's reflected here is the driveway to the lot that's owned by Money Pit LLC. I believe it is A1 Landscaping that operates on that lot. We're showing a wider driveway to allow turning movements that won't conflict with the new pedestrian and bicycle infrastructures or the median barriers. And again, the final configuration will be determined by the diagnostic team study.